let's go ahead and get started. So I'm Dave Ruder, Franklin's On Water. Nice to see everybody here in person again. Picking me up okay. We're doing both virtual and in person right now. So speakers, when you're up to the podium here, kind of stay in this area just so we get that recording. That way we can also have some of the virtual people chime in and ask questions as well. And good crowd. Glad to see everybody here. Glad we're going back to in person again. Expect some more of this throughout the year now, hopefully. So we'll get started here. So did want to mention Brooke Frusher back there. She's my tech guru for this. Hopefully it all works for us. You have questions, feel free to ask us. Now this isn't switching for me. What happened? Okay. So that seemed to be working now. Let me switch back. There we go. First off, so I do want to thank our community partners. Most of you guys are in those municipalities and help us present this kind of stuff. So thank you again. We do recognize everybody here. And it's part of what we do is this kind of training for you guys. So I hope you take some value out of this and get some good information. We've got a pretty good lineup. This year, we're kind of looking at sustainable resiliency practices. So our future talks will kind of be in that theme. And this kind of is the kickoff to that. We have, I'm skipping around a little bit. So first off, some upcoming events that we have coming up. Next roundtable, like I say, is July 27th. We've got the SWIP training reminders in here for our municipalities. You know, there are some requirements for your good housekeeping requirements. We send out notifications of those, you know, things like doing inspections of your facilities. Keep that in mind. And of course, these kind of events for training, future training with XCal, we have that with some of our municipalities as well. So take advantage of that and get your annual trainings out of the way. Stormwater Awareness Week is coming up October 1st and 7th. If you've got community outreach things you're doing, this would be a good time to really dovetail with that time frame and get some of that outreach needs that you need for your MS4 permit. So think about that. Anything you can do there would be great, and let us know because we can advertise that to a greater community. This is really going statewide. We're going to see if there will be a state resolution for Stormwater Week and get this broad statewide outreach. This summer, we have the post-construction inspection and maintenance certification courses. We've held that in the past. It's coming back again here to Columbus or Cleveland this summer. Registration is open the 30th, it looks like. Okay. So today's presentation, we have Geddy from OSU. He will be here talking shortly. A lot of good information about some of the handouts you got. If you look at that and have looked at the recent urban review, this information is related to all of that. Geddy's going to go into a lot more detail on that and how that might affect our local conditions here. Kari, MS Consultants, she's got the our new OSWA extreme weather committee. So she'll be talking a little bit to how things are affecting stormwater practices. And again, I did want to mention OSWA. I'm also a board member of OSWA. If you want to get that broader outreach, kind of see what's going around in the state, you know, I really recommend looking at an OSWA membership. We have some great committees. And it really does kind of broaden, get you out of our local view a lot of times and let you see what's happening with the state. A lot of good training opportunities there. We partner with a lot of the certification courses and get reduced prices on some of that training through OSWA membership. Of course, there will be certification. We'll get to that at the end. Remind everybody again, be sure you sign in to get that. So let's get started a little bit. This, like I said, was in the Urban Review. This is some of the GLISA information that you see in the handouts. But something I want to point out is these are percent changes that we're looking at in various parts of the state. So all this, if you went to the stormwater conference, you heard about these extreme events being really tied to the dew point. And you can kind of see that in this illustration here, because we've got, where the lakefronts are at, you're getting these changes, 20% changes in the intensity of storm events. You look down where we're at, you've even got some actual reductions anticipated in that. So there's not going to really be a statewide solution to this. We really need to look locally kind of at what kind of changes are necessary to build in that resiliency. This was the other graph that was in the Urban Review. And what I wanted to point out here was, so these values here are the values that we're currently using for design purposes for stormwater. You notice, this is a type 2 storm event, 10-year event. They're looking at 3.74 inches. This data is from 2006, which actually this data was created in 2006 from data that only goes up to December of 2000. So that's currently where we're designing projects. Here we're up already, the models, and again, this is a combination of models created to look at various scenarios for weather conditions. We're currently already at 4.02 if we take this yearly data. If you look at these values here, these are median values in the precipitation tables. There's a 90% confidence interval that is based around. It's the median value. That upper limit is close to where we're at here already. So we're already approving, building, and designing plans that are perhaps already at that extreme of the 90% confidence interval. So that's something I want to point out here. And we should be looking at ways to build in some resiliency, with our current stormwater. So with that, I'm going to move to Geddy and get you powered up here. All right. Now, use a clicker if you need. If you stay in this area, you can roam a little bit,
but not much.
Not much.
Okay, makes sense. Do a clicker test real quick. This works nice. Okay, great. All right, thanks everybody for coming out. My name is Geddy Davis. I'm the Weather and Climate Services Program Coordinator at the Byrd Center, and I'm also a key partner with the State Climate Office of Ohio. And my job primarily involves sharing weather and climate information to Ohioans through both the State Climate Office as well as the Education and Outreach Wing of the Byrd Center. So with that quick introduction out of the way, I want to jump right into the discussion today. I have this broken up into a couple different parts, but I first want to start with an overview of the large picture. So looking at the globe as a whole, we've heard that things have been a little bit warmer lately, haven't we? And if you look at recent stats, 2022 was the 6th warmest year on our climatic records, which go generally back until 1880. And as you can see by the global land and ocean animation and surface temperatures, we've gone through a little bit of a shift in the past few decades, moving from average to below average temperatures gradually into more above average temperatures on our global surface. In fact, the top 10 warmest years on Earth have all occurred since 2005, and the last 8 years since 2015, the last 8 years since 2022 have all been the top 8 warmest. So this is 2022 back to about 2015. So why does that matter when it comes to water? A warmer atmosphere can hold more water vapor. And as a result, that impacts the patterns and intensity of precipitation we see on Earth. In Ohio, this is no different. We've seen changes. The trend in Ohio's precipitation changes in the climatic record, which in our state goes to 1895, is on the tune of about 0.3 of an inch per decade. So when you think about this, this isn't just plus or minus 0.31 every 10 years. This is intensity and seasonal changes and fluctuations, changes in patterns that we normally see and we normally build our infrastructure around. And you can see this looking at the season to season. So using months, key months as proxies for seasonal changes, looking at our most recent 30-year climate period, which is 1991 to 2020. These are kind of the NCEI 30-year periods that we use for averages. This is 1991 to 2020 minus the previous 30-year record, 1981 to 2010. Looking at January, we can see around a 10% increase or change in precipitation in our state in the Ohio Valley. So indicative of wetter winters. And this trend continues into the spring. So looking at April, we continue to see those greens, those 10, 15% changes, especially concentrated in the lower Ohio Valley and into the mid-Mississippi Valley. As we move into summer, we see these changes start to kind of wash out, fade away, and we see a little bit of variability emerge. So pockets with green kind of positive changes, but also some brown negative changes, some lighter browns mixed in with the greens. And by the time we get back to October and into the fall, we see the green start to make an appearance again within most of the state. So the key takeaway here is that we are experiencing wetter winters and springs, as well as increased precipitation variability locally in our state. We look even more localized, so looking at precipitation intensity in the Columbus area. On the left, we have extreme daily rainfall counts by half decade, or in other terms, the number of 1 inch or greater events experienced at Columbus over 5-year increments. So this is from 1950 to 2019. Each bar is about 5 years worth of events. And you can see there's a fair amount of variability in the first half of this graph, but starting around the 1985 timeframe, we start to see a persistent upward trend in these bars. And I don't want you all to just look at the bars themselves, but I also want you to look at the breakdown of the colors, primarily this lime green color and this really pale green color. The lime green color are 2 to 3 inch rainfall events, and the pale green are 3 inch plus rainfall events. So these are significant, impactful rainfall events that are on the rise, not just rainfall itself, but the more extreme disruptive events that can overwhelm infrastructure and disrupt daily life. Looking at this another way, on the right, we have percentage of annual precipitation greater than 1 inch. So what this is saying is essentially, what is the percentage of the total rainfall events each year caused by these 1 inch or greater rainfall events? This data goes from 1948 to 2020, so a similar-ish window. And this trend is also on the increase. At the beginning of this graph, you see a clustering of these points, kind of in the 20 to 30% of yearly events caused by these 1 inch or greater events. As we move closer to present day, that number increases to around 30 to 40%, a clustering of those points. See kind of at the end there. So we are seeing changes both in seasonal trends and in intensity. And as a result, this is causing impacts. It's no surprise then if we look at our top 10 warmest and wettest years in Ohio, focusing here on the precipitation side, that a lot of these top 10 years are fairly recent. In fact, 8 of the top 10 wettest years in Ohio are after 1990, and 6 of these top 10 occur after the year 2000. So fairly recent turn of events here. And this in turn causes numerous direct and indirect impacts. So Dave did a good job of setting this up for me. Atlas 14 is the official peer-reviewed record of precipitation frequency estimates for the United States and its affiliated territories, produced by the Weather Service. This was the data in Dave's graph that he was discussing moments ago. And this is where one of the indirect impacts really comes into play, because a lot of this guidance is used by you all in some way, shape, or form when it comes to infrastructure design, water engineering, whether it's stormwater, wastewater, other water utilities, etc. And what we're finding is that this data now is not accurately quantifying what we're seeing. So Ohio is located within volume 2 of Atlas 14, which covers the Great Lakes and Mid-Atlantic. This was released in 2004, but the records of this data only cover up through December 2000. It integrates daily and hourly stations, and it integrates a fair amount of data, but then it stops, right? And we're all the way forward now here into May 2023. So almost 23 years of missing data. And in the past, Atlas 14 was never really funded by congressional appropriations, but rather just by affected states and other users on a reimbursable basis. So states would come forward that were impacted by events saying, hey, we want to be a part of this program. We're putting forward some money. NOAA would match that money, and then the study would begin. But that method is also kind of fallen out of favor. So there's really been a need to update this guidance for development and for infrastructure design. But thankfully, we're not the only ones who recognize that. NOAA, within the last year, has put forth a national effort summary called Our Changing Precipitation, where it overviews this problem as well as a problem with the methodology within Atlas 14, which is that the guidance within this program is based on a concept which is known as temporal stationarity, which essentially assumes that extreme precipitation events do not change significantly over time. But looking at the data on these slides, we're learning that that's not the case, right? These events are changing over time. And as a result, that impacts our guidance. So NOAA put forth a recommendation summary advocating for a timely updating of Atlas 14 or the development of an equivalent that incorporates non-stationarity and new observational data, as well as considerations for future climate change and risk assessments for long-lived infrastructure and design plans. There's also provisions in here to improve accuracy of climate models for precipitation predictions. And believe it or not, this has moved forward within the federal government. So at the end of last year, a majority of these bits and pieces were integrated into 2 pieces of legislation, the Floods Act and the Precip Act, which have been essentially approved and passed through Congress and have led to an official update of NOAA Atlas 14 or a successor program to be coming nationwide down the road and to be updated at least every 5 to 10 years. These updates will incorporate those methods of non-stationarity and evolving data and guidance that I have brought up here in this first portion. So are there any questions about this so far? I have these checkpoints built in because there's a lot I want to go over, and I don't want to just cram all the questions to the end. So this is just kind of the overview of where we're at right now before I go into some of the work we're doing locally.
So the Atlas 14 is that being implemented now? And then Atlas 15 is coming, I heard 2027, is that?
Yeah, so the updated Atlas program, whatever it may be called, right now it's in, I forget what it's like a national committee review, essentially. So it's working through the process of developing a methodology, getting approved by national, I forget what it is, National Universities, National Academy Review. Thank you, Jason. So it's going through that process of being reviewed and implemented, but that process from the federal government side is very slow. It's very methodical, and odds are, yeah, 2027 at earliest for those official projections.
Those are just for Reader's Digest version of what that is. That provides guidance on precipitation.
Yes. So it provides guidance on precipitation and probability of occurrence, basically. So when you look at NOAA Atlas 14 data, you essentially either get a recurrence curve or a tabular set of data. And within that data, you typically see precipitation amounts or depth in inches, and then average recurrence intervals. So when you hear an event was a 100-year event or a 500-year event, that's essentially a probability for the odds of that event to occur within your local region. It's not necessarily something that'll happen once every 500 years, but rather a 1 in 500 chance of occurrence. So that's the data that is provided by Atlas 14, and then engineers and stormwater designers and other users then take that and design their infrastructure accordingly for capacity or for flow or whatever method or use you need. Anything else? Anything online back there, Brooke?
Nope, I'm not seeing any questions.
Okay. So as Kari just mentioned, this is great. It's good that these updates are coming from the federal side, but they're a long way down the road. What do we do in the meantime? Franklin Soil and Water approached us at the Byrd Center at Ohio State about this very topic, and with an idea to at least update local data and information in Franklin County and try and get either at minimum updated data and at best some updated projections into the system so that folks here in Franklin County can at least start looking at this. And so with this information in mind, we've moved forward at the Byrd Center with the development of a tool that is called the Ohio Precipitation Estimate Tool. It's essentially designed to create a stopgap measure and improve precipitation estimates and provide new precipitation data for the Franklin County region. The goal of this, again, is to update that precipitation data, but then also create outputs that mirror what's available via Atlas 14 to at least give folks an idea of what this changing data and information might look like. Now, I want to make one thing very clear. Again, this is output that mirrors what's available via Atlas 14. This is not replacing Atlas 14 as official guidance. This is not supplementing or partnering with NOAA or Atlas 14 or in any way, shape, or form. This is an exercise in data updating and exploration to give people an idea of what changes may look like in our region when this data comes out. This will assess the potential impacts of updating precipitation information, and knowledge gained via this analysis will be shared with both local practitioners and other communities who are interested in replicating this process or getting a head start in what changing precipitation projections may look like. And this will be shared via both an intuitive website and an accessible code repository. So how do we do this, right? The best way to kind of go about breaking down what we've done here is to compare some methodology first and then go into some of our results and then some of our outputs. So looking at Atlas 14 again, Atlas 14 uses daily and hourly station precipitation data. It then goes in and does a lot of statistical work. So it utilizes a statistical method called a generalized extreme value function combined with some statistical regions called L regions to essentially fit a distribution function to precipitation data. Now, I was not a fan of statistics in high school or college, so I don't want to go too far into this rabbit hole. But what you essentially need to know about this is that this is a method used to approximate models of maxima, or extremes of long sequences of variables. So what this essentially does is that it takes this long sequence of precipitation data and it models it to bring forward the maximums of projections. This does really well, but it leaves little room for variability, especially regarding extreme or changing precipitation events. Not to mention that Atlas 14 also had to make multiple consistency adjustments with their data to get things to fit properly and to process properly. So this includes adjusting daily and hourly station quantiles where there may have been overlaps. Same thing with the confidence intervals. If there are overlaps or missing gaps, these things had to be adjusted. Our tool uses mainly daily station data from around Franklin County, and it couples this with a data set known as PRISM, which is a national interpolated precipitation data set taken at a 4-kilometer grid spacing. So what this does is this gives us some flexibility to where if there are stations in Franklin County that are out of date or out of operation, we can couple what data they do have with this PRISM data set to give us an idea of past and current precipitation data and events. We also used a statistical method, but when we used the Atlas 14 method of the GEV, things did not work very well for us. There were issues with both the extremes and the non-extremes, so data where there were zeros or trace amounts. So we used a different method. It's called a generalized Pareto method. And this distribution essentially fits the data and analyzes excess precipitation in the right tail of the distribution, so the extreme side of the distribution. Again, statistics are not my favorite thing, but essentially what this does, this is a different method to get to a similar result as Atlas 14. So whereas Atlas 14 sequences variables to find an approximation of the maximum, we analyze the area under the right tail of the maximum side of the distribution to get our numbers. This method was found to encompass more variability of extreme precipitation. However, this also leaves us vulnerable to some setbacks, including increased spatial variability and more variability within our confidence intervals. And outside of filling in some data gaps with Prism and filling in some spots where data was missing or zeroed out, we did not apply any consistency adjustments. These consistency adjustments include things like weighting, ratio coefficients, and et cetera, and we did not apply any of this to the tool yet. As far as choosing stations, there are 6 active cooperative or ASO stations in the Columbus region in Franklin County. Each one has kind of a varying historical record. So John Glenn International Airport, 1948 to present, is known as Columbus's climate site. That's where the Weather Service operated and maintained station is, and it has a record from 1948 to present. So that is one station we included in our analysis. There's a station up in Westerville, which is a cooperative observer station, which is, again, a cooperation between the Weather Service and private observers. This record is the longest available record in Franklin County. This is 1896 to present, still in operation and still provides data to this day. So we included that station. But then other stations pose some problems for us. There's a station up in Easton that had a record of 1975 to present, but it had so much missing data in it that it was essentially unusable. It had over 775 missing data points just looking within the last 30 years or so. And there are other stations such as KOSU and WCMH and Parsons Avenue that are still active and are relatively new, but this brings the drawback that the records at these stations are not very long. So they're not very suitable for the analysis that we were trying to do. However, there are also numerous stations in the Columbus area that operated in the past and are no longer operating. So we found a station on the west side of Columbus at Sullivan Avenue that had an intact record from 1952 to 1983. When 1983 came around, the station fell out of operation. So what we did is we took this historical record of this station and attached the Prism data set to it to fill in the gap from the 1983 station quit date to the present day. And this provided us with some proof of concept for using this Prism data set to help supplement current and active station data. And as a result, we ended up with 3 stations in our final analysis: Columbus CMH, Westerville, and Sullivan Avenue. Now, let's look at some of the results themselves. And this is where things start to get kind of hairy. These are the 5 outputs that were produced by our analysis, layered all together in one graphic of one-day precipitation frequency estimates. So the top left is CMH, top right is Sullivan Avenue, and bottom left is Westerville. And the intervals here vary. We have the Atlas 14 data set, which is the black line, but then we have our 1953 to 2022 complete data set. So 1953, if you recall, is the end of, or the beginning of the Sullivan Avenue station record, which is our shortest record. So we went from the shortest record of our available stations to the present day using a combination of both station and Prism precipitation data. And the results at each station, unfortunately, do not provide a very clear signal. We see a lot of variation from point to point in this analysis. The This is something, again, that Dave had kind of mentioned in his introduction, but it's something that we see not only at a national or state level, but at a local level as well. So from 1953 to 2022, we see that the overall record of our analysis actually lags behind the Atlas 14 estimations at KCMH. But as we look at some of these other data sets that we include, so 1981 to 2022 is the record of the PRISM data set that we used. And then 1993 to 2022 are the last 30 years of data. And then 2003 to 2022 are the most recent 20 years of data. We see that we see the increasing trends at CMH over time, especially as you get into the 25, 100, and 200 year intervals and beyond. We see these changes happening at this station. However, this is not universal. If we look at Sullivan Avenue, we see that Atlas 14 again outpaces our analysis, but then we see that both the larger records, so 1953 to 2022, and then our interval records, so PRISM data set, and then the most recent 20 and 30 year records, all fall short of the Atlas 14 data. And at Westerville, we see that Atlas 14 and our large 70-year set are fairly close together. And then as we get closer and closer to present day, these trends actually fall off. So this tells us multiple things. It tells us that precipitation estimates and intensity vary both spatially and with period of record. So you can see extreme precipitation events in this analysis affect each station differently, and how we include this in period of record changes what we see in terms of precipitation frequency. This does, though, provide a nice proof of concept for how PRISM precipitation data and station data locally can be used to develop a more flexible, responsive, and up-to-date tool for monitoring precipitation extremes. So we then integrated this into a user interface website. This is the Ohio Precipitation Tool website. It comes with a map of the stations that we included in our analysis, as well as tabular and graphic outputs for precipitation frequency estimates at our stations. The tabular data includes 95% lower and upper confidence intervals, as well as the estimates and return periods. And we have drop downs and graphic selection for stations, as well as different periods and sources that I went through in the previous slide. So we have Atlas 14 in here, but then we have our 1953 to 2022 analysis, and then the PRISM data set, and then most recent 20 and 30 year intervals. And you can run multiple comparisons using this website. So we have it set up so that all of our tabular and graphic outputs can be downloaded and compared. Tabular outputs can be downloaded via CSV files. Graphic outputs can be downloaded via PNG files. And then if you want to run page-to-page site comparisons, you can download the comparisons by essentially a PDF of one location versus the next location on the web page. And you can use this to do multiple different analyses of different time periods and then different station locations to assess this variability. This project has also resulted in a complete PRISM database. So we decided to store the precipitation data that we pulled down along with our code in an accessible code repository at Ohio State. This code can be used to interpret which distribution fit can be used to model precipitation frequency. And the PRISM data can be interacted with. So any data at any location can be subset and determined based on latitude, longitude. We also have code to create the graphic and tabular outputs that are included on our website and compare different configurations. So this project can be easily adapted to other areas in Franklin County, to regions beyond Franklin County, and maybe even eventually into the state of Ohio as a whole, as we continue to wait on updated official federal projections. We also have a draft summary coming out of all the back-end analysis soon. Okay, that was a lot. So here's checkpoint 2 for questions. Yes.
I'm not familiar with Prism.
Sure.
What's the source of that data or?
So Prism is a collaboration between, I believe it is, I think it's Colorado State, who collaborated with NOAA and some others to create this large spatially interpolated data set. I'll look that up and confirm. It was a big effort with a few different Western universities and partners who were involved in producing this.
So it's well vetted, but it's 24-hour interval. There's a
Yeah.
limit as to time window of data.
Yes.
It isn't a full set of every time window.
You base your data on this information, not know because of what your gap know was 40.
Right. Exactly. So this Prism data set comes all the way up to the present day, or at least the most recent year. So it comes all the way up to 2022, and Atlas 14 data only comes up to 2000 in our current volume.
So your data, are you taking precipitation photos for each month and then calculating your data? Or is it taking the average?
No, so this is only 24-hour rainfall data, essentially. So it would be great to have those larger timescales and those intervals, but we only really had 24-hour data available to us in Prism. But that is still useful because when you think of precipitation events that really impact practitioners, they're still 24-hour events generally. I'm sorry, can you?
How many years, like, how many years of precipitation do you need to have? Like minimum, how many years?
So at minimum, we have about 70 years, but we can extend that longer depending on the records of the stations we're looking at. So for example, if we look solely at the Westerville station, that historical record goes all the way back to 1896. And while there may be gaps and poor data collection in that larger record, you could theoretically do this analysis from that whole time scale. We just included the 7-year window, so 1953 to 2022, because we wanted to show all 3 stations at essentially a set time scale, and that was determined by the station with the shortest record, which was Sullivan Avenue.
Yeah, so most of your actual rainfall was daily, right? And then you interpret data based on Prism data for 24 hours. But you may not be aware, we still Columbus maintains a very large rainfall network, and that collects data for the last 30 years.
Mhm.
20 to 30 sites, irrigation station, that have 5 minutes of
Mhm.
data. So I don't know if that's going to help you improve the model you're building, or is that any value?
That might be something to look into for future research. We had looked at a couple other similar data sets as well, but we ended up settling on the 24-hour data sets because it was the thing that was most consistently available. It was the thing that was most accessible, and it was really easy to work with in our modeling process.
Yeah, do you think that's the reason why your models kind of tail off in long term, is that short time frame that you're looking at?
I think so. I think there's a lot that goes into that. So I think our methodology absolutely could be improved. I think there are some things we need to learn yet with our version of the model. So as I mentioned, there are corrections and consistency adjustments that Atlas 14 did to create a nice, well-rounded picture for different areas. There were station weights that they included. There were ratios and coefficients that they included in their model to help balance things out. And those are things that we either didn't have time to develop or didn't have institutional access to include. So the data set we use is important. The methods we use to do the analyzing are important. And there's a lot we would like to do in the future to continue to improve this tool and this product to make it as best of a stopgap as we can until the more official federal methods come out.
So I'm Jason Cervinek. I work with Geddy at the Byrd Center and the State Climate Office. One thing to keep in mind is there's a cost benefit analysis here. We were able to do this fast with data piggybacked off a prior project to get a result out. We approached the state to do this much more comprehensively statewide. That was declined. So this was designed to give everybody a stopgap really fast, piggybacking off other projects. But, and he'll talk about it next, there is ways we can look at things geographically to improve this or import other data sets.
Right.
But all that's cost benefit analysis. What's the time available and what's the resource available to try to get us something to fill the gap.
Right.
So just keep in mind, that was weighing on
Yeah.
us fast.
Yeah.
With what was available with a
Yeah.
pretty small budget.
Fast and cheap.
Yes. And it's a stopgap. We know 4 or 5 years out, but there's a lot of stuff that's probably gonna be built with federal resources, especially in the next 4 years. So waiting might not be.
So previous to 2000, no one was keeping records. Back to when?
So NOAA has been keeping records and each site varies, right? So as I mentioned, in Ohio, climatic records go back to about 1895, but then individual station points were established at different times. So Westerville, for example, has been keeping records since all the way back in 1896, whereas more official Weather Service owned, operated, maintained sites tend to appear around 1930s, 1950s in the state. And all of these records then contributed to the Atlas 14 product, which contains roughly 40 to 60 years of either hourly or daily station data. Yes. Yeah. And then these stations haven't stopped collecting data in the meantime. There just has not been an update since the Atlas 14 product came out.
There is records, you just went on the board of late 2020 or 2000.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, the station records beyond 2000 are around and we use them, but more often than not, there are either new stations that showed up and had a really short period of record, or there were stations that were in operation and then fell out of operation. So PRISM served solely to shore up and to supplement the available station data that we had.
Radical changes based on 20 years, not radical changes based on 140.
That's one of the available options, yes. Again, period of record plays an important role, as you're saying. But determining what that period of record that best exemplifies what we're seeing is what's difficult. Yeah, you're welcome. Anything else?
Yeah, we look at 3 stations, right?
Right.
You different, basically different forecast,
Different projections, yeah.
different projections. So as a user, like, what?
It's not very helpful, is it?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so which one do I go with? Go with the,
Well, and again, this is not official guidance again. So, but I see your point, and my best answer to that would be that picking one graph necessarily isn't going to help you yet in this case, but looking at this and coming away with the conclusion that we are seeing more localized availability, or not availability, localized variability in our extreme precipitation is kind of the key idea to walk away from, and then to walk away from this with. And then with that, you can then start to think about, okay, if we're seeing extreme local variability and we're also seeing increases in intensity, how do we then need to start thinking about designing bigger with more flow capacity or more water capacity? I work quite a bit with engineers, and they have a lot of the metrics in their head that I do not, but there are different capacities and ratios and things that engineers design stormwater infrastructure and wastewater infrastructure with, that are designed around these numbers, using these numbers as input for calculations. And the takeaway is that, okay, do we need to start thinking about changing these numbers? If we do, what's the best place to start? This is kind of a stopgap and a discussion starter, essentially. And as we move forward, and I guess I'll just use this kind of transition to the next portion, we know we can make this better. And we know there's much more future research that we can do to get you a firm answer on which graph we should use. But in the meantime, this is again, kind of an exercise in data exploration to start thinking about what changes we might see and how we should react to them. Does that make sense? Thank you. So strengths and weaknesses, the website itself is robust and easily adaptable. It's built on a very basic framework. It has options for downloading data in multiple different ways, as well as portraying data in different ways. The code and framework is in place to easily and efficiently expand or adjust the scope of this project. And then the precipitation data that we use is easily accessible via the repository. So we're being very transparent about what we're using, and we encourage others to check it out and start looking into it for projections of their own. But a lot of the weaknesses we are very well aware of, and everyone has kind of touched on a few of them here in this question session. Can decision makers be accurately informed with only 3 stations? Odds are probably not, especially with inconsistent results from station to station that are really kind of screaming about this variability. What do we need to do as researchers on our end to make these results consistent? We need to do a lot as far as looking at the methodology, looking at these consistency adjustments that Atlas 14 includes. Can we adapt them to our model? Can we do more with our methodology to either change how we're using the PRISM data or change how we're using point data to portray more meaningful, more consistent results? And then is the data we are portraying to practitioners useful in the meantime? So are presenting this as recurrence intervals useful to practitioners or engineers or local officials? Are we presenting the right types of data? So are we emphasizing the right confidence intervals? Is 95% too much or not enough? Are focusing on recurrence intervals, so 100, 500, 1,000 year, is that useful? Is it the right type of data, or are there different types? We really want to hear feedback on this from folks like you guys and folks like engineers, folks from the city, if this is useful and if it will help, and if we're portraying things that you need correctly. Again, there's a cost benefit analysis to be done here, but if we can single out 2 or 3 things that people really, really need and then present that to you in a useful way, then we would see this as a success. Future research, again, the key question here is, what is the optimal method and spatial scale for characterizing extreme precipitation characteristics in Franklin County, and then maybe beyond into Ohio? So in the future, we'd really like to expand this analysis to additional locations in Franklin County, and then perhaps even the wider Central Ohio region. Concurrently, we want to continue to refine our methods to provide consistent, clear results and messaging. That's the biggest thing. If we can't present a clear product, then it's unfortunate. But if we can, and we can get you those 2 or 3 key things that you need, then it's a success. We want to continue to supplement more station data with PRISM so that precipitation frequency estimates are based on complete and up-to-date historical data. We know not every county has a multitude of stations like Franklin County has. But if there's a county with stations that were in operation and then fell out of operation, we still feel like we can use them consistently and reliably using this PRISM data extension. And finally, we want to use the results to recommend an optimal method and historical record for characterizing precipitation in present day. So again, like the questions in the back were saying, which graphs should we use? Which data should we use? We want to be able to recommend that with some confidence until this Atlas 14 update can come out. So in summary, in this first phase, we have updated historical data through present day and expanded the number of point-based precipitation estimates in the county using these 3 stations. We created point-based precipitation recurrence intervals based on this updated data. We created an end user interface and website designed to emulate the function of the current Atlas 14 product. And then we've shared this with internal and county stakeholders to evaluate its use and design. Those surveys are actually still circulating. I know we've done some stuff with MORPC and Franklin Soil and Water to get this out to key stakeholders. But there's still more to do. And then we have an initial publication that is being put together of our findings and results as well. So a lot of the content that I've just talked to you about will be in this publication. Phase 2, what we hope to do, this is something that is still in its infancy and has not yet been funded, but we hope to find somebody who sees the importance in this work and push this forward. So we want to expand the scope of the project to other areas in Franklin County and beyond, and continue to revise our methodology. We want to use our updated projections to evaluate other aspects of the physical modeling space. So how does this data go into models that engineers use, or how does this go into models that insurance adjusters use, or how does this go into models that the city uses? And then with these updated projections, we can maybe even begin a more broader conversation with key stakeholders for decisions such as design and planning and et cetera. Again, before Atlas 14 update even comes out, we hope to start to have the ball rolling on some of this process. And again, this is big work. This is heavy work. It's complicated. It's messy, but it's important. It's an important part of steps to resiliency when looking at changing climate patterns. It all starts locally. So in this flow chart by the climate.gov toolkit, we're kind of in between step 1 and 2 right now with this process. So we know what the climate threat is, the changes in precipitation patterns, but we are working to assess our vulnerability and our risks and our projections here. And with this work, we can start to move on in this process to taking action, to building up our infrastructure, to adapting to the changing patterns that we see. And that's all I have. Anything else?
Geddy, I have a question.
Yes.
I think most of the people know you, so Franklin County and the city of Columbus have taken pretty great steps to manage stormwater, advancing standards. But I think we all know that we're also being impacted by the big bad intel and a lot of growth that's coming to Central Ohio.
Yes.
And it scares me because I don't think the surrounding counties has as much advanced standards as Franklin County does. Have you guys done any cursory analysis on the available data and stations that are in Lincoln County and Knox County and Delaware County? Because that's where the growth is going to be. And I'd like to get in front of it before, we're following 1950 standards.
Yeah, and while I didn't touch on it, yeah, that's kind of the elephant in the room, is that we have a lot of growth and changes coming to the region through your Intels and your Hondas and your Googles of the world, who are all kind of flocking to this area that, by comparison to some of the coastal areas, really isn't worried about some of the other impacts that we're seeing. Right, exactly. So to get to the root of your question, within the publication, there's some very preliminary work being done in identifying surrounding stations. So I actually have a call with our lead researcher on this, practitioner, Zach Wieser, who actually did a lot of this model running. So if there are any more in-depth questions about that, I can direct you to him. But we're doing some preliminary identifying of where some of our wider data points could come from, because we also want to be able to continue to carry on this work and pick up where we left off should additional funding sources come along to continue this more consistently. Yeah, so we're looking around. We're looking at the Central Ohio region. I believe we looked at some stuff in Licking County, some stuff in Delaware County, some stuff to the west of the city as well. I don't have the full list finalized and what's going to be included in the publication as tentative next steps, but we are looking.
Geddy, there is a question in the chat from online.
Sure.
Gentleman's asking, as a meteorologist, any insight into why these storm events are happening?
So the increase in moisture capacity in the atmosphere is a big driver. So thinking about this in a meteorological lens, increased moisture in the atmosphere, usually coming from Gulf of Mexico or Atlantic sources. So that kind of converges in the Ohio Valley ahead of storm systems. And then what we're finding is that storms are also more efficient precipitation producers. So what essentially that means is this increased availability of precipitation in the atmosphere, or of moisture in the atmosphere. Storms are utilizing that precipitation and producing it more efficiently. So there are processes within the updrafts of thunderstorms and downdrafts that there's research going into why this is happening, but they're essentially maximizing their potential to produce heavy rainfall with this available moisture. And so what we're seeing is that there are several events, even here in Franklin County, where you have slow moving, heavy thunderstorms that are either floating along a stationary front or a boundary that's slowly moving through the area. And you're seeing, 3 to 5 inch rainfall events in the course of, 1, 2, 3 hours. And these are also super localized. So there are examples. I don't know if anyone remembers Reynoldsburg a couple of years ago, where the east side of the city got, 4 to 5 inches of rain in 90 minutes. And the west side was like, oh, it thundered for a little bit. That was the extent of the impact on the west side. There was some rain, but nowhere near the extent of the core of the thunderstorm, which was over and lingering over eastern neighborhoods. So Reynoldsburg, Gahanna, those areas. So that's a little bit, it's a very involved question, but I hope I touch on it, on some of the factors a little bit.
Yep, thank you.
Anything else?
Do you think the weather's being manipulated by the federal government? You know, there's no big trails out there or cloud seeding operations or nothing like that going on?
Nope.
Okay.
No, it's a fair question, but the atmosphere and meteorology is super dynamic. There's a lot we don't understand, and there's a lot that we may not understand for another few decades yet. So it's such a broad dynamic field, but it impacts all of us, right? So that's why we want to know, and we want to figure out explanations for these phenomenon.
Didn't you say one time, Geddy, that so there were several experiences with blizzard in 1978.
Oh yes.
But you youngins have never seen anything like that.
No.
So I think it's changing. I mean,
And that wasn't an anomaly, it was a storm.
it was.
6 foot of snow overnight, it's crazy.
Anything else? Well, thank you, Geddy.
Thanks, everyone.
Let's take a little short break here. I was, yeah, I think so. We started counting. What should we do? Should we let people, the pizza has arrived. I will tell you that. Can they eat while you talk?
Yeah, well, I think,
So we'll keep moving, but if you want to take a little break now, grab a slice of pizza, come back to your chairs. We'll get going here in very short, as soon as I get things changed over. How's that? Okay. Well, I was very excited to hear Geddy's talk. That's the first time I heard some of their input from the study. So it was quite interesting to see what was coming out of that. Like they said, that second phase is not funded. So if you have funding sources and of interest, talk to these guys. This is data that, we are looking at plans and approving features out there, that have a 25, 50 year life cycle. There's going to be some, levels of service decreases in these things. And there's various ways that we're looking at what can we do to build in that resiliency right now. And I will say one thing, if you went to the stormwater conferences or the OSWA webinar, Tetra Tech did a really good job of talking about things we can do to improve what we're doing right now. And one of the ones that I'm particularly fond of is looking at that 90% confidence interval and using the higher value of that confidence interval. If you remember that graph that I showed you, we're using that 3.73 for a 10-year storm event. Right now, it's about 4.02 in the current data on those curves. That's about the upper limit of that confidence interval for that 372. So if you're designing something, perhaps you're approving plans with that upper limit to build in some of that resiliency at the moment. Think about that when you look at plans and look at facilities that, like I say, you're going to have a 50-year life cycle on these things. So 50 years in the future, they may be undersized regardless. So that's something that we're looking at as far as how do we build in resiliency now. And like you see in the data, that local effort is really where this is going to have to happen. That variability, going to have to look at it broadly. We can't do this really in a national sense or I think the NOAA 15 is coming. There's going to likely be changes for it, but whether that's locally effective, I'm not sure. So with that, I'm going to give it over to Kari and we'll move on here.
Good afternoon. I guess coupling on what Dave just said, I really think that, we do great things here in Franklin County in the city of Columbus. There are pretty strong stormwater standards and regulations, but a lot of our growth, and we're going to be impacted here in Columbus, a lot of our growth is happening outside of this very minute area. I think that some type of consortium or group come together to identify NOAA 18 for the greater Central Ohio area would be the best thing that could happen, because development is happening at such a fast clip. And we all know that, it's extremely aggressive. So I hope that we can figure out a way to fund some additional research so we can get this NOAA out there and protect the resources that we have in the greater Central Ohio area. So I'm going to talk a little bit about stormwater challenges in the face of climate change. I'm going to have a lot of pretty pictures. I work with a lot of rural communities, and so unlike maybe the city of Columbus, they don't have access to the engineering community that does this type of work, and so they really have fallen behind a little bit. So I want to talk about what can they do as practitioners, and maybe the gentleman that wears 4 or 5 hats in his community, because he's not just the flood administrator, he deals with the public parks, he deals with all of these things. And what can we help these rural communities advance their standards in thinking of how climate change can, or how we can help with their climate change issues. And I'm Kari Mackenbach, by the way. I'm with MS Consultants. I'm Vice President of Strategic Pursuits. I've had several nicknames over the years. One is Green Queen. I do a lot of green infrastructure and resiliency planning, but my background is floodplain management. My first job right out of the gate was Licking County floodplain administrator. So I got the privilege of going through 2 very giant storms, 1996 and 97. Yes, I'm dating myself. And it really changed and evolved my career because of that experience. Let's see. Okay, Dave. No. But
Do Brooke. I think I just need to.
There we go.
There we go.
whoop. Just gonna hit that
Well,
instead.
try now. It should. There you go.
Okay. Whoop. All right. So this is what I'm going to be covering today. What do we know about the challenges of stormwater and climate change? What have we seen really work and what doesn't? As it relates to more sustainable practices to combat those climate change concerns. Lessons learned and case studies on sustainable projects using GSI, that's green stormwater infrastructure. There's a lot of vernacular floating out there. That's probably part of the problem of the sustainable world, is that they have so many different terms for the same thing: rain garden, bioinfiltration device. So as practitioners, we are working through OSWA to try to slow, I guess not widen the gap, make it smaller, so we're all talking about the same vernacular and what that is. And then I'm going to talk about something called flip the script. And I'm just going to tease you on that so you stay engaged, because this is something that I promote in rural communities, and I'm not as applicable here in Franklin and City of Columbus, but it is something that we should be looking at. And then the OSWA Extreme Events Committee, I am the current chair. We just started our group, and Geddy is part of our group as well. And really what we want to do with this this committee through OSWA is to provide a vehicle for other communities to understand what's happening with extreme events and how they can understand them better so they can eloquently speak about them in their communities. So for the longest time, we've said this is the way it must have been before we came and developed, right? And I dare say it probably wasn't like that, but we're now dealing with increased impervious surfaces and increased flows. We're dealing with decreases in water quality. Of course, there's the Clean Water Act that was established back in the 1970s to try to combat that. We've had increased erosion and sediment in our streams, and we also have a lot of increased flooding. Before climate change was a thing, I used to preach that if you have more impervious surfaces and you're not doing something about it, you're going to have unhappy streams. And what did I mean by unhappy streams? You have streams that were imploding on themselves. The erosion was happening on the sides. That picture there, that graphic over here on the right. I mean, this is what streams look like even to this day. This is streams in central Ohio, right? Maybe not all of them, but we have a lot of unhappy streams. All of that increased impervious surface has devastated our natural infrastructure. So what do we really know about climate change? And I'm going to read this. This is from the US EPA. Climate change includes more frequent and intense storms, more extreme flooding events, and it can increase stormwater runoff. An increase in stormwater runoff can exacerbate existing and introduce new pollutant problems. Whoops. The other thing we know about climate change in the state of Ohio, the average temperature in Ohio has risen 1.5 degrees since the beginning of the 20th century. Droughts have also increased. Now, we're an agricultural state, so this is a big deal. I know there are some people that kind of roll their eyes when they say droughts. It's like, hey, I'm okay with all the sun, but that really impacts our economics of our state of Ohio. And the other thing that's probably the most important, at least to me as a floodplain or a CFM, a certified floodplain manager practitioner, is that we're seeing increased heavy rain events. And the increased rain events that we're seeing are those 2-year extreme events. And this is one of the statistics. This came from NOAA. This is the one that affects our natural infrastructure. You know, we have 100-year events. That's the big dog. And dare I say, that's not even the big dog anymore. We're having the 500-year events. But those 2-year, those 5-year, those 7-year events, those are the ones that are affecting our infrastructure and affecting our communities. And they're so repetitive. It's hard to be resilient against those types of storm events. This little guy has followed me around since I was in Licking County, I want to say. I actually created this, and I don't even know what program it was. It's that old, but it's a good representation of how we manage stormwater. The traditional regional technique is looking at how do we take that stormwater that's impacting that new building and route it to a detention basin and be done with it. There's new techniques out there. In here, I've called them distributed stormwater features, green infrastructure. Some say poking holes in the plexiglass of our watersheds to be able to allow that water to infiltrate into that watershed or that area that you're trying to control. The other concept that has really taken root, and especially here in Columbus, is integrated stormwater management. Looking at your existing systems and how do you integrate more sustainable controls within that system, not getting rid of the detention basins, but trying to make them work better by integrating distributed controls or green infrastructure, GSI, whatever you want to call it. So here we have the Walmarts of the world and their wonderful, beautiful detention basins. And like I said, maybe not here in Franklin County, maybe not here in Central Ohio or in Columbus, but I still see them. But you talk about rural America, this is the way that they handle stormwater. And not only are these ugly, they're dangerous, and they're an eyesore, and are they really functioning the way that you want them to function? What is that life cycle of that practice? The only large scale green infrastructure practice that I know of that took a different route was the Franklin County Jail that's been put in. They put in a pervious application. Now we've got great examples of green infrastructure all over the city, but this was, we had to flip the script with them. We showed them why this made sense via a life cycle cost, why putting in a permeable practice for their parking lots made sense. So this is a project, gosh, I was part of back in, this is crazy to say this, but 2006, we installed green infrastructure. This was up in Minnesota, and it was a very much a pilot project at the time. And it really demonstrated, the exciting part about this study was they were looking at water quality benefits of green infrastructure. They couldn't monitor the water quality because the bioswales and rain guards they put in collected so much water that nothing was coming out. So this demonstrated to me that green infrastructure is working. We have to figure out a way to put it into the norm, into the regular mindsets of us designers and practitioners, and how this might work in our existing systems. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the proven GSI systems that we know work. And of course, these are some sustainable examples. It's a very long list of practices. Everything from bioinfiltration, like you see in the top, to the permeable paper. I'm going to talk a little bit about several of these projects. And we know that many of these do work, and some of them just don't work well where they were cited. And that's part of the issue with green infrastructure is a lot of folks get this, well, it didn't work, so I'm just going to go back to the traditional approach. And it's like, well, that didn't work there because here's why you didn't cite it correctly. So as a floodplain administrator, or sorry, as a CFM, I look at green infrastructure as a solution that we should really be looking at to address those smaller events that we have. And I had this PowerPoint slide somewhere else, and I said it didn't impact large events. Well, I changed it because we know that green infrastructure and other sustainable practices do help with the resiliency of your system. So a good example, I'm going to go off script real quick. So you have all of these storms hitting the East Coast. Superstorm Sandy was a good example of one that came through. And you're spending millions of dollars reestablishing the coastline. And the question is what can you do to armor that system to make sure that when that next storm comes, because it's coming, how can you better be prepared and be more resilient for that next storm? So we know that sustainable design provides resiliency. I'm not saying it solves it. It won't solve it, but it will provide the resiliency to come back after the storm event goes through. Permeable sidewalks. This is a good technique that works. It has to usually be work in tandem with turf grass because it needs some type of buffer to allow for sediments to get into that turf grass, because if it gets into the permeable system, then it may not work as well. Permeable streets, this was put in back in 2015. This is on a 7% grade slope in the city of Pittsburgh. And it is working very well. In fact, it is a pilot project that now is the norm when we have to rebuild streets in the city of Pittsburgh. So I'll show you a little bit more of the design here. Whoop. Baby. Okay, there it is. So it's a series of check dams underneath that allow it to infiltrate and drop in. And then there's a cleaning system, just two regular pipes on the sides that help with sediment. And they did not think it was going to work. And these are the kind of projects that I love when they say that they're not going to work. And it is working and functioning well. And it is, like I said, now the norm for very steep streets that are getting redone in the city of Pittsburgh. Here's some pictures of it. So one of the things that we had to grapple with, though, and I know I could do a whole presentation just on this, is it was a great pilot and experiment, but getting interagencies to agree that this was something that was acceptable was a very big lift, very big lift. And I think what it highlighted was a lot of the issues with the installation or consideration of sustainable practices is because each agency didn't agree with each other. So it came down to looking at ways to collaborate on the specs, and that the integrated thought process for this project was a win-win. Bioinfiltration bump outs, we've got several of these in the city of Columbus. We've got bioinfiltration. This one is in Kansas City. Collect a lot of stormwater. They're visually appealing. We do have some issues somewhat if there's a lot of parking on the street and you're taking away people's parking. I think we know now in Columbus that the maintenance on these is rather high expense compared to maybe some other techniques, but it is still something to consider and look at. The biotree trench, this is basically a long linear rain garden that is protected by pervious pavement. Several of these have been installed in the northeast. We have one in Defiance that's rather large, and it's collecting a whole lot of stormwater. So it's a great technique that kind of hides the fact that it's a bioinfiltration device. And if you have a lot of foot traffic, it's a great technique to use. This is just a picture of the city of Columbus and their one of our practices in I can't remember the name of the area. It's coming up next here. So one of the things I mentioned about integrated planning, one of our first blueprint projects at MS, we had a lot of opportunity for the use of green infrastructure, but we also had a significant amount of flooding that still stuck around after we were doing some of the initial calculations and analyses of what needed to happen. So when I use the words integrated planning, it is, or integrated strategies, it is looking at what green infrastructure does in tandem with maybe upsizing some of your system. And in this instance, it got rid of the flooding and the green infrastructure worked as needed. But if we've just installed the green infrastructure and didn't fix the stormwater problem, it would have been a failure because the people would have seen that what is the green infrastructure doing? So this was a good example of how integrated planning does work. And this just shows you, so that replacing the existing storm sewer and adding some storm sewer relief, we helped to upsize that system, and now that area is free from localized flooding. So this integrated planning is a win-win. Blueprint vision has evolved water quality or water quantity first with direct benefit with quality, and it was very cost effective. A little nod to, you know, I had mentioned earlier when Geddy was up here, you know, we do some pretty advanced stuff in the city of Columbus and Franklin County, and this is one of them. This effort to evaluate regional stormwater basins within the city of Columbus has taken off and been quite amazing. It's a great example. We use this in other places. We say that this is a great thing to copy because of how they're looking at controlling stormwater on a larger scale. All right, flipping the script. This picture came from Cleveland Magazine, and it was interesting because the article focused on how Intel was affecting them. And so, you know, I think about that, and I think, you know, we're all content and happy to talk about how we manage stormwater here in Franklin County, but at the end of the day, we're building stuff here in Columbus that we weren't intending to build for 30 years. And this development on the eastern side of Columbus will impact all of us. And so one of the concepts or ideas is to flip the script. So you have regulations for stormwater management. You've had them and they've probably never changed. And I'm talking even Licking County has no advanced standards. It's the way that they've had them. Their subdivision regulations are the same. And dealing with developers, they're not amenable to change. However, if you don't affect their time and money, they'll do it. And so a lot of communities have given a nod to sustainable design, but they say, here are the options. You can do it the traditional way, or you can look at this green infrastructure practices. Well, given the choice, they're going to pick the traditional design every single time. So why don't we promote the idea of having the advanced standards first and say, this is what we want for our community. We want you to look at different types of stormwater controls and incentivize them to do that. Maybe put them up in a different top of the list to be reviewed, or however you want to do it. But I really challenge us as practitioners that we need to start looking at this and not just do it the old fashioned way and then come back in 25 years and retrofit what we designed then. So this is something, you know, I said, how would the development community feel about this? Like I said, it's all about time and money. So if you give them, here's what we want you to design, and here's what it's gonna, you know, we're gonna promote you, or we're gonna put you at the top of the list and get you approved faster, they're gonna do it. But if you don't do those things, then we're never gonna advance our stormwater standards. The standards that I see in the rural communities are the same I saw 30 years ago, 50 years ago. They have not evolved. And I continue to do stormwater and flooding studies. I suspect I'll be doing a lot more in the future. But we have the ability to flip the script and control what's coming into Central Ohio. Last thing, as I said, I am the chair, and the only reason I'm a chair is because somebody asked me to do it. I do find it fascinating. I always, you know, my husband doesn't necessarily believe in climate change. It's always a fun conversation. However, me, I look at the data. I see the people being more impacted by storm events. I see people who are on the floodplain fringe that are now 100% within the floodplain. I see people on the East Coast that have houses that they thought were going to be there forever that are falling in. And that is change. We are evolving. And so we should be looking more at how can we understand the data and use the data to the betterment of us. Now we're in the state of Ohio. Maybe people would say, well, that's not a big deal here. I really think we have to be looking more critically at how we handle and manage stormwater. We're trying to be a vehicle for those local rural communities that maybe don't have the ability to understand, comprehend those standards, and provide them maybe with language that they could consider, that they could put into their regulations as an addendum for larger scale developments or for even single family developments. That is what we're trying to do. And listening to the experts like Geddy and the OSU on what is it that we should be considering. But the fact that NOAA 14 hasn't even been adopted yet just dumbfounds me. And so we need to do something. And I know that the NOAA 15 is going to be significantly more, a lot more, how do I say it? One of my engineers explained it to me that the analysis of what a 100-year event is now versus what it is in 2027 when that comes out, or even later, is significantly greater. So we're building all this infrastructure now for what? You know, at what design level? What should we really be considering to protect ourselves for the future? And that is it. Do you have any questions? Like I have 4 of them in there.
So most of our problems is the outer development flowing into the older development.
Yes.
As smaller systems that are designed on anywhere from 1975 to whatever. So don't you think most of the problems we have is because of the development, and it's really going to stop?
Right.
So I mean, we're losing farm land at vast numbers to bring in people and industries and so on and so forth. So at this point, we have to come up to deflect the storm goes from other angle. So instead of coming in 6 kilometers inside the river, going through all the storm pipes, we need to make a new outer belt of storm water to go down around. I mean, where does it start? I mean, how do you develop that?
Well, that is a very good question. I mean, I'll give you an example of, so Intel is at the headwaters of the South Fork Licking River.
Sure.
Everybody know Buckeye Lake area? Everybody know that I-70 shuts down pretty much annually because of, it should never have been built there. I mean, I think it flooded the year after it was built, 1958. So we've got terrible flooding along I-70. It affects all of the communities around. And now we've got significant development at the headwaters. And everyone's like, oh, that's great, but oh goodness, how is Intel going to get their product to the East Coast? I think what we should be doing is looking at things on a watershed-wide scale. We look at things at site scale, we can look at things in a subdivision, that's all great, but we should be looking at things on a watershed-wide scale and coming up with an understanding of how that watershed works. And for the South Fork, a 2D model was developed. Nobody knew, everyone assumed, had all kinds of opinions for literally the last 50 years as why that watershed floods the way it does. The 2D model explains exactly how it's happening. And when it comes down to it, there's just a whole bunch of water, whole bunch.
Sure.
And it's really hard to mitigate with, you can't do it with green infrastructure, but what can you do?
And you can't go against nature's boundary.
No.
There's flood zones for flood reasons.
Right.
We've designed our sewers around the flood zone. So at this point, we're going to have lift stations to pump water out around flood zones, or deeper sewers that go deeper below to get down to the lower elevation. So it goes to the Ohio River or pick up water
Yeah,
source from
right.
Sting County or.
Right,
So we're fighting the topography.
you're right.
And there's only so much you can do.
There's only so much you can do, but we can do better.
So now we're talking vast amounts of projects to build these super highways for stormwater to get
Mhm.
around their flood zones, because we're not flooding residential areas.
We're pushing it downstream if we don't address it
Well,
at its source.
Absolutely, but
Mhm.
that's what we have to do, because unless we start filling in the flood zones with soils and make it all flat and, rather than a hillside.
Well, FEMA won't like that,
Yeah, of
right?
course.
Well, I'm not coming here with the solution. I just know that when I talk to communities, there's a community that I'm dealing with right now in northern Fairfield County that they're so sick of flooding, and they flood constantly. These 2-year events are just inundating them. So we told them, hey, y'all live in a floodplain. So this is what happens now. What we can do is help you with the level of service and look at maybe reducing some of those smaller events. So you're not dealing with those 2-year storms, those 5-year storms, and you're not having, but a 100-year event comes around, you're all gonna be impacted, but your resiliency will be there because you're prepared for those lower events. Those critical short, intense storms are the ones that we're seeing more and more and more in these communities. And they just don't know how to handle it. They regulation wise, everyone's super excited about all the new development, but why aren't we pushing more to the development community to do higher standards? Make them pay for it. Why does the communities have to then come back after the fact and fix the problems?
Out in these outlying counties like Franklin, they got more power than what they realize. They got a big developer comes in and says, oh, we want to do this, and this, and the only thing they've dealt with over the years is, hey, Jim wants to put up auto body sign up in front of his house. I said, okay, yeah. So they're getting overwhelmed and thinking, oh, we got signs. No, they actually got more power than they think. And they can ask for a lot of stuff. They have these developers.
I think there's this fear, the person who's on the front line dealing with the developer versus the county commissioners are seeing the growth and they want the growth to happen. You let them do what they need to do to get that in. And that can't be the way anymore. And the experience that I've had with developers is they'll do what you ask them to do, as long as it's simple language, it's clear, it's black and white, it's not questionable, they'll do it. Because like I said, time and money, those two things are interchangeable with them.
They know it's a good site.
Right.
And
We had a developer come into Worthington, and all I can tell you is that the initials were two initials. Anyway, he said to me, because we were representing Worthington, you can't do that sustainable stuff here. That's the stuff that happens in Oregon. This was a year ago. And I was like, huh? What are you even saying? He's like, that only happens on the West Coast. So I think the development community even needs to be a little educated on what is a sustainable practice and how do we need to think outside the box and just build a detention basin when we put a subdivision in and then turning around and taking out some of the silt and sediment and turning that into a pond. You know, they're developers are a little lazy. I'm going to say it. That's right. I said it. I don't work for developers, so I'm okay to say that. I think that if we push them, they'll react, and I don't think it's going to be negative as long as it's plain and simple. It cannot be all over the place. We want you to do this sustainable development, and if you can't do it, let's say it's a burden on your development, then explain to us why, and we'll still let you do the traditional development standards. Explain to us why you can't do it. But if we don't take that first step, they're going to take the easiest path every single time. Everyone's nodding. Yeah.
Yeah, the 15th is Friday. So having a standard,
Mhm.
you know, and that's been an issue since I came around 5 years ago. So we have no standard, you know, in our city. It says pick one free.
And you guys are held light years above the rural communities, light years. I mean, Gehanna asked if I could help them look at some of their regulations for development, and they wanted to flip the script. They wanted to make development do these more non-traditional, maybe consider the options. And the council was like, no. So you have to have a agreement from the top down that this is something that you want to promote, because we haven't really evolved in stormwater. We have some great pilots and some exciting stuff out there, but as a state, I mean, no, we have not. It's the same standards. It's follow the Ohio manual. That's it. And until we get some real data like NOAA 14 and agree to apply it, we're just, go ahead.
One other thing besides life cycle analysis is what your options for conversation with public health are, because on our team, the other things we're worried about are urban heat island. So a lot of the stuff you're discussing mitigates that. And there's a number of studies come out looking at these 1-2 punches, we lose power. And then we have a massive heat wave, which we saw in Columbus last year. Those neighborhoods without tree canopy and some evaporative cooling end up being disproportionately high. Mental health benefits, traffic issues, speeds on roads, which is an issue in Columbus.
Right.
So there's all these co-benefits if you factor in
100%.
can come with it, and the cost might be negligible, but you get those long-term investments that we're seeing reports consistently coming out about.
No, I've been practicing the green infrastructure world in the green infrastructure since 2008. And I've seen what the co-benefits are. It's the EPA, US EPA at least, have done a lot of studies on that. I think a lot of people just discount it, that it's not real, you know, and I get a lot of questions about maintenance. Oh, it's so expensive. It's like, well, what about traditional stormwater? There's a maintenance aspect to that too. So one of the ways that we've tried to dispel that is showing them what that life cycle cost is. Here's the life cycle cost. Here's the return on your investment. We have to treat green infrastructure just like anything else in our toolbox. And it may not be the solution every time that makes sense.
That's really an end user is gets the benefits of the green infrastructure. It's not developer. So it's hard to sometimes link that what that does. Oh.
Solar farms.
Yeah.
Oh boy.
Yep, so I've got a couple questions in the chat box. So Eric there has curious, has anyone studied the impacts of solar farms on stormwater standard? I would imagine a 1,000 acre impervious solar panels would alter the rainwater runoff at a location. So I guess.
I don't know about advanced studies, but I can tell you that Licking County has been bombarded. This was even before Intel with these types of practices, and they have taken a hard line on the stormwater side, and in fact went toe to toe with them and said, you will manage the stormwater on the site. Because they made it sound like it was, oh, it's a green practice. It's like, no, it's impervious. You basically made a rural farm now completely impervious. So they've taken a pretty hard line. I know that Morpsey might have some more information on that because I know that these are popping up all over the place. But yes, I think stormwater, you might as well treat it as it's a completely impervious source.
Western Extension's got a webinar that's happening actually right now. Goes to, I think, 31st. They're discussing solar.
And then the second one that is the issue that the storms are increasing, or is it just that we have built more in the areas that should not be developed?
Both. It's both. The storms, like I said, those small little storms the spring storms, those real heavy summer storms, they're increasing. That is impacting our natural infrastructure. It's impacting communities. And someone mentioned Reynoldsburg. I mean, that's a good example of they got whacked big time. And ironically, my sister lives there. So I heard it both on the news and from her. And the building in floodplains, we do a pretty good job at that. We have some random one-offs where people think they can build in the floodplain, and organizations or other types of practices. But for the most part, the NFIP protects our floodplains. And if you want to build in a floodway or a floodplain, typically you have to either you have to have a permit, but you have to also do a study to show hydraulically and hydrologically how you're changing that floodplain. So we've done that since like 1978, the NFIP. Now, some of the standards haven't been updated, but the communities can only use what they have. So our floodplains for the most part, and I think for most developers realize that if they're going to build in a floodplain, that it wouldn't be the greatest idea. There are some exceptions to that idea, but I think it's both.
And that's all I had in my chat box there. So open it back up to the floor.
Any other questions? Yes.
So do you think it would help some of the rural communities if they implemented stormwater fees so that they had some money also to?
Well, there is the talk of the stormwater utility. And when I mentioned the Franklin County Jail, that's actually how we convinced them to put in the pervious pavement. We showed them that their return on investment in 30 years, they would save almost $800,000. That was it right there. They were going to put in detention basins, and they were going to put in trees because they were required to put in trees. And we said, you can put your trees in somewhere else. You probably want a line of sight, you know, now that it's a prison. I mean, it's a LEED prison, LEED accredited prison. So I don't know what that's all about, but nonetheless, the stormwater, we demonstrated in the stormwater utility. The problem is most rural communities they don't even have a person to do that. And a lot of them are picking a number out of the air and saying, hey, this community over here charged this, and we're going to do the same thing. And it sets it up for failure, because you have to have a separate source of funds that are dedicated to stormwater practices. And that's just extra staff, it's happening. Lima has one, a lot of communities, I think Knox County, I can't remember the town, they have one. There's several that have been popping up, but for the rural communities where these developments are going in, it's just the counties. So there's not very many county utilities. There is one, I think Summit County has one. But it is a way to fund your stormwater. You know, I said back early in my career, we're going to be paying as much for stormwater as we do for sanitary by the end of my career. But it's getting, hurry up here, it's getting close. So any other questions?
All
right.
Looks like we are just right on time, pretty much.
Yeah.
I thank you all for attending, and look forward to our July next roundtable. Hopefully the online stuff did okay for folks, but feel free to come here in person again in July. CEUs, Brooke, you'll be sending that out At
Yes,
some point, be sure you sign up back on the table there. If you hadn't, just sign in so we can get that credit to you.
I will just say with the holiday next week, maybe give me 2 weeks to get all that over to you.
Yeah.
So
You'll get
But
it sometime.
we'll get the recordings, copies of the presentations and all that. So yes.
I appreciate your time and have a good afternoon. Thank you.